Sir, you seem to have taken a wrong turn. This is a restricted transit corridor. The voice was young, crisp, and saturated with the kind of unearned authority that comes straight from a newly minted officer's academy. Lieutenant Caden Croft, all sharp angles and polished insignia, stood with his arms crossed, a human roadblock in the sterile, echoing hallway of the airport's lower level. Before him stood a man who looked as though he'd been plucked from a field and dropped into this world of polished tile and fluorescent lights by a tornado. His flannel shirt was worn soft at the elbows, his jeans faded to the color of a summer sky, and his hands, thick with calluses, were resting patiently on the handle of a battered canvas duffel bag. He smelled faintly of earth and hay, a scent utterly alien in this environment of recycled air and jet fuel. Everything about him was soft, rounded, and weathered, a stark contrast to the high-strung, kinetic energy of the 7 crated animals and their uniformed handlers lining the corridor behind the lieutenant. The old man's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, moved from the lieutenant's face to the row of crates, lingering for a moment before returning. He didn't seem intimidated or confused, merely observant. "Just waiting on my flight," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble. "Gate B4. Boarding in an hour. Thought I'd stretch my legs." Croft's posture didn't relax. "Well, B4 is upstairs and 2 terminals over. This area is for K9 unit transport. These are military working dogs. It's not a place for civilians to be stretching." He gestured with his chin toward the end of the hall. "If you'll just head back the way you came, the main concourse is up the escalators." The old man gave a slow, deliberate nod, but he didn't move. His gaze had drifted back to the dogs. Inside the ventilated transport crates, 7 sets of keen eyes watched him. Belgian Malinois, German Shepherds, a Dutch Shepherd, the elite canine soldiers of the United States military. They were supposed to be in a controlled state of rest, conserving energy for the long flight ahead. But they weren't resting. A low, almost subsonic whine began to emanate from the crate housing the largest Malinois, a battle-scarred male named Ares. It wasn't a sound of aggression, not yet. It was a sound of deep, resonant uncertainty. Lieutenant Croft noticed the shift immediately. He glanced back at the handler nearest Ares, a young airman named Garcia. "What's with him, Garcia?" "Settle him down," Garcia, looking flustered, knelt by the crate. "Easy, boy. Easy, Ares," he spoke in low, soothing tones, but the dog ignored him completely. Its focus, laser-sharp and unwavering, was fixed on the old farmer. Then a second dog, a sable shepherd named Ripley, began to pace in her crate, the click-clack of her nails on the metal floor a frantic counterpoint to Ares' low hum. Within seconds, the entire line of dogs was in a state of quiet, intense agitation. The handlers exchanged worried looks, their hands moving to rest on the crate doors, their voices a chorus of hushed commands that were having absolutely no effect. This was wrong. These were Tier 1 assets, dogs with thousands of hours of training, conditioned to be stone-cold steady in any environment. A crowded airport corridor with a lost civilian shouldn't even register. Yet, they were all coming undone. Croft's face tightened with annoyance and a flicker of genuine concern. This old man's presence was disrupting his detail. "Sir," he said, his voice losing its polite edge, "I need you to leave. Now, you're upsetting the animals." The farmer, whose name was Eli Sandoval, finally looked away from the dogs and met the lieutenant's gaze. There was no apology in his eyes, no fear. There was only a profound and unsettling stillness. "They're not upset," Eli said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried over the rising tension in the hall. "They're confused," Croft scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "I think my handlers and I know when our own dogs are upset. You're an unknown variable, and you're agitating them. Please, move along." But Eli didn't move. His feet were planted on the tile, as if he'd grown roots. He watched the handlers, saw the tightening of their grips, the sweat beading on Garcia's brow, the way they were posturing themselves against the animals instead of working with them. He saw 7 highly trained professionals being systematically ignored by their partners. And he saw the reason. It wasn't him, not exactly. It was what he represented. It was a scent, a posture, a way of holding his space in the world that they recognized on a level so primal it bypassed their modern training. Across the corridor, leaning against a support pillar and observing the entire exchange, was Master Sergeant Regina Mills. She was the NCOIC of the Transit Detail, a veteran of 15 years in security forces with 3 tours as a handler herself. She knew dogs, and she knew soldiers. Lieutenant Croft, for all his bluster, was green. He saw a problem to be solved with authority. Mills, however, saw a puzzle. She had noticed the old farmer a few minutes before Croft had. He hadn't wandered in by accident. His steps had been deliberate, his path leading him here as if drawn by a magnet. She'd watched him stop and simply watch. And she'd watched the dogs respond. She'd seen what Croft missed. When the old man stood, he wasn't stooped with age. There was a subtle alignment to his spine, a balance in his stance that spoke of a body conditioned to carry weight and maintain a low center of gravity. It was the posture of a man who had spent a lifetime on his feet, but not behind a plow. It was the practiced stillness of a hunter or a soldier in Overwatch. Then she looked at his hands. Croft saw Farmer's hands, and he wasn't wrong. They were weathered by sun and soil. But Mills saw more. Across the knuckles of his right hand was a thin, white, ropey scar, the kind you get from a leash or a rope pulling through your grip at high speed, burning through gloves and skin. She saw a tiny, puckered scar near his left thumb, consistent with a canine tooth catching flesh during a missed bite sleeve exercise. They were the small, telltale marks of a life spent at the other end of a leash from a very powerful animal. But most of all, it was his eyes. They weren't the wandering, unfocused eyes of a lost old man. They were the eyes of a master handler. He wasn't just looking at the dogs. He was reading them. He tracked the flick of an ear, the subtle shift in weight, the dilation of their pupils from 20 feet away. He was absorbing 1,000 points of data per second, and his utter lack of reaction, his calmness in the face of their growing chaos, was the most telling sign of all. He wasn't a threat causing agitation. He was an anomaly causing a system crash. A ghost in the machine. Master Sergeant Mills felt a cold prickle of awareness crawl up her spine. She didn't know who this man was, but he was no farmer. Or rather, he was a farmer now, but he had been something else entirely before. Something that these dogs, on a level beyond human comprehension, still recognized. The situation deteriorated with shocking speed. Ares, the big Malinois, threw himself against the door of his crate with a force that made the metal groan. The sound was a crash of thunder in the confined space, and it broke the dam of restraint. A chorus of sharp, frantic barks erupted from the other crates. The dogs weren't being aggressive, they were sounding an alarm. It was a cacophony of confusion, a desperate call for clarity. The handlers were now in a full-blown struggle, their bodies braced against the shuddering crates, their voices loud and strained. Ares, down, down, Garcia yelled, his voice cracking. Ripley, enough. Quiet. The commands were useless, swallowed by the noise. Tourists and airport staff were beginning to peek around the corner, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. The scene was spiraling out of control, reflecting poorly on Croft, his unit, and the entire military presence. Croft's face was pale, his professional composure shredded. This was his first command, his first major transport assignment. It was supposed to be a flawless execution. Now, it was a public spectacle on the verge of becoming a safety incident. He turned on Eli, his fear and humiliation curdling into raw anger. I gave you an order, old man. Get out of here before I have you arrested for interfering with a military operation. He took a step forward, his hand moving toward the farmer's arm, intending to physically escort him away. He saw the old man as the single, inexplicable cause of his failure, a wrench thrown into the gears of his perfectly planned operation. He needed him gone. He needed to regain control. His entire career, in that compressed, panicked moment, felt like it was hanging on his ability to remove this one stubborn, silent old man from the hallway. But as his fingers were about to touch the worn flannel of Eli's sleeve, everything changed. Eli Sandoval did not flinch. He did not brace for the contact. He simply raised his left hand, palm out, a universal gesture to halt. It wasn't aimed at Lieutenant Croft. It was a signal to the universe to just wait. He took one small, deliberate step forward, placing himself more centrally in the corridor, in the direct line of sight of all 7 crated dogs. His body language transformed. The soft, rounded shoulders of the farmer squared slightly. The subtle alignment of his spine became ramrod straight. The air around him seemed to thicken, to coalesce into an aura of absolute, unshakable command. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He was simply present, and in that presence, he was the only thing in the universe that mattered. The cacophony of barking faltered. A few dogs fell silent, their heads cocked, their ears swiveling to pinpoint the source of this new, powerful gravity. Eli's pale blue eyes swept over them, from crate to crate, making a connection with each animal. He wasn't looking at them as dogs. He was looking at them as soldiers, acknowledging each one individually. He saw their confusion, their stress, the conflict between their training and their instincts. And he knew exactly how to resolve it. His gaze finally settled on Ares, the magnificent, powerful Malinois who had started the chain reaction. The dog was still pressed against the crate door, a low growl vibrating through its chest, but its frantic energy had been replaced by a tense, watchful stillness. Eli's lips barely moved. He didn't shout a command. He didn't project his voice. He spoke one word, soft and low, yet it cut through the residual noise of the airport like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a word none of the handlers had ever heard before. It wasn't in any training manual. Asa, it was an old word, a foundational word, a word that meant more than a simple command. It was a key, unlocking the deepest, most fundamental levels of their conditioning. The result was instantaneous, absolute, and profoundly eerie. It was as if Eli's single, quiet word had severed 7 puppet strings at the exact same moment. Ares, the powerful Malinois, dropped. He didn't just lie down. His body went slack, and he hit the floor of his crate with a heavy thud, his head resting on his paws, his tail giving one slow thump against the metal. At the same microsecond, Ripley went down. The Dutch shepherd, the other 2 Malinois, the 2 German shepherds, all 7 dogs collapsed into a perfect, synchronized, submissive downstay. The frantic energy, the barking, the whining, it all vanished. An unnerving silence descended upon the corridor, broken only by the distant hum of the airport and the ragged, shocked breathing of the handlers. They stared, mouths agape, at their animals. The dogs were utterly still, their bodies relaxed, but their eyes, every single one of them, were fixed on Eli Sandoval with an expression of what could only be described as profound relief. The storm had passed. The source of the conflict had resolved it. They had been given the one signal they were desperately seeking. Lieutenant Croft stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the air where Eli's arm had been. His mind struggled to process what his eyes had just seen. It was impossible. It defied every protocol, every training manual, everything he knew about canine handling. He had just witnessed 7 of the most highly trained, aggressive, and disciplined animals on the planet be brought to heel simultaneously by a lost old farmer with a single, nonsensical word. The foundation of his authority, built on regulations and rank, had crumbled to dust. He was no longer in command of the situation. He hadn't been for some time. The real authority in the hallway was the quiet man in the flannel shirt. Croft slowly lowered his hand. The anger was gone, replaced by a wave of cold, humbling confusion. He looked from the perfectly still dogs to the old man, who now seemed to have shrunk back into his unassuming posture, the immense presence he had projected just moments before receding like the tide. What was that? Croft's voice was barely a whisper. Who are you? Eli Sandoval didn't answer right away. He looked at the dogs, a flicker of something sad and deeply affectionate in his eyes, the look of a man seeing old comrades in arms. He seemed reluctant to speak, as if the explanation itself was a burden. He was about to offer a simple, dismissive answer, to say it was just a lucky guess, when another voice cut through the silence. That was a foundational release, Master Sergeant Mills said, her voice filled with a dawning, reverent awe. She had pushed off the pillar and was now walking toward them, her eyes not on her lieutenant, but locked on Eli. She stopped a respectful 10 feet away, her posture shifting from that of a supervisor to that of a subordinate addressing a senior. She didn't know his name or rank, but she recognized his authority. It was a language spoken without words, and she was fluent. The ASA protocol. I've only ever read about it in the historical archives. From the Phoenix program. It wasn't just a command, was it? It was a state of being designator. She looked at Eli, her question hanging in the air, an invitation for him to confirm what she already suspected. She was giving him a way to explain without having to boast, a professional courtesy from one old soldier to another. Croft looked back and forth between his master sergeant and the old farmer, his confusion deepening. Phoenix Program? ASA Protocol? These were terms he had never heard, ghosts from a past era of the K-9 Corps. Eli finally turned his full attention to Master Sergeant Mills. He saw in her eyes a shared understanding, a common heritage. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You have a good memory, Master Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet. He then turned to the still baffled lieutenant. "The dogs weren't agitated by me, son. They were agitated by my context." He paused, choosing his words with care, the way a master craftsman chooses his tools. Every handler has a scent, a posture, a pressure. It's how the dogs know who is in charge. Your handlers have it. You have it. But it's the modern version, refined over the last 20 years. What I have is older, deeper. He explained that the Phoenix program was an experimental initiative from the late 80s and early 90s, an attempt to create a deeper, more intuitive bond with the dogs, to move beyond simple command and response and into a shared cognitive space. They worked with the foundational bloodlines, the very dogs that were the grandsires and great-grandsires of the animals in these crates. "ASA," he continued, his voice taking on a professorial tone, "is not a command like sit or stay, it's a signal. It translates roughly to the purpose is complete. It tells them that the state of high alert, the constant search for a threat, the very reason for their existence as a weapon, is over. It's permission to stand down not just their bodies, but their minds. It's the ultimate all clear." The dogs had sensed his presence, this deep-seated, almost genetic marker of ultimate authority, but they were receiving no corresponding commands. They were seeing a 4-star general in janitor's clothes. The conflict between what their instincts were screaming at them and what their handlers were telling them was causing a massive cognitive dissonance. They were like soldiers, Eli finished softly, seeing a ghost of their first drill instructor. They didn't know whether to salute or run. All I did was tell them the parade was over, and they could go to the barracks. Lieutenant Caden Croft felt as though the polished floor had dropped out from under him. In the space of 5 minutes, his entire worldview had been inverted. He had looked at Eli Sandoval and seen an obstacle, a bumbling civilian, a problem to be managed. He had asserted his rank, his authority, his training, and had failed spectacularly. This man, with no uniform, no rank, and no weapon, had commanded more respect and obedience with a single word than Croft had with his entire presence. He saw the scene with painful clarity now, the old man's patience, his calm observation, his utter lack of fear. It hadn't been disrespect, it had been a diagnosis. He had been watching the problem, understanding it, while Croft had just been yelling at the symptoms. A hot flush of shame washed over him. He thought of his condescending tone, his dismissive attitude, his threat to have the man arrested. The arrogance was suffocating. I apologize, sir," Croft stammered, the word sir coming out instinctively, a recognition of a rank far superior to his own, even if it wasn't visible on a uniform. "I completely misread the situation. I was out of line." Eli offered a simple, forgiving shrug. "You were protecting your troops. Your instincts were right. Your interpretation was wrong. It happens. The important thing isn't the mistake. It's what you do after you recognize it." He looked at the young handlers, who were still staring at their now peaceful dogs with wonder. "You have good people here, Lieutenant. And good partners." He pointed a calloused finger at Garcia. That young man with Aries. He kept his head. He didn't punish the dog for its confusion. He tried to reassure it. That's the mark of a real handler. Nurture that. Garcia looked up, his face flushing with pride at the unexpected praise from the living legend he didn't even know. Croft felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the lesson, but for the grace with which it was delivered. The old man could have humiliated him, exposed his incompetence to his entire team. Instead, he had defused the situation, educated him, and then gone out of his way to praise one of his airmen. It was a masterclass in leadership. Eli Sandoval checked the simple, well-worn watch on his wrist. The crystal was scratched, the leather band cracked, but it likely kept perfect time. "My flight," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He picked up his canvas duffel, the motion fluid and economical, and settled its weight on his shoulder. "I'm heading up to Montana to see my granddaughter. She just made honor roll. In that simple statement, he was gone. The legend, the ghost, the master trainer from the Phoenix program vanished, and in his place stood only a proud grandfather on his way to a family visit. He had solved their crisis, taught a profound lesson, and now he was simply moving on, seeking no credit, no recognition. He just wanted to catch his plane. He gave another nod to Master Sergeant Mills, a silent acknowledgement of their shared world. To Croft, he offered a small, encouraging smile. "Listen to your dogs, Lieutenant," he said. "They'll tell you everything you need to know long before the men will." He then turned and began walking down the corridor, his boots making soft, scuffing sounds on the tile. He didn't look back. Lieutenant Croft watched him go, his mind reeling. He felt an urgent need to ask for his name, his old unit, for some way to quantify the experience, to put a name to the force of nature he had just encountered. But he knew it would be a pointless, even disrespectful, question. The man's identity wasn't in a name or a unit patch. It was in his actions. It was in the silence he commanded. Master Sergeant Mills came to stand beside him. "You won't find him in any of the current rosters, sir," she said quietly, as if reading his mind. "Men like that, from programs like that, when they retire, their records get buried so deep you'd need a drill rig to find them. They just fade away, become farmers, or fishermen, or grandfathers." They stood in silence, watching until the old man disappeared up the escalator and was absorbed back into the anonymous river of civilians, becoming just one more face in the crowd. The corridor was quiet now. The 7 dogs were resting peacefully, the crisis completely averted. But for Caden Croft, nothing would ever be the same. The rigid, black and white world of regulations and authority had been shattered, replaced by a glimpse into a world of deeper truths, of instinct, respect, and a quiet competence that needed no uniform to be recognized. He had been humbled, but in that humility, he had found a new path to becoming the leader he was meant to be. He looked at his dogs, then at his handlers, with new eyes. His real training, he realized, had just begun.